The sun had set, and it had cast long shadows in this quiet neighborhood. Streetlights started to flicker alive down the cul-de-sac, where an old retired war dog named Thor was lazily lying on a porch. Now grayed with age, had spent years in the military, sniffing out explosives and protecting his handlers. Finally getting his well-deserved rest, he sprawled under the warm evening sky. But tonight was different. Thor's ears twitched, picking up a sound, a faint rustle in the distance. His eyes, once sharp and alert, narrowed, and he raised his head, sniffing the air. Something was off. A scent, one that felt familiar yet oddly distant, drifted to his nose. He growled, a low rumble that sent a shiver down the spine of anyone nearby. But the street was empty, quiet. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves. Meanwhile, in the shadows, one form stirred, a figure of a man in his late 30s, clad in a worn leather jacket, his head hidden beneath a cap. He moved gingerly around to the yard, the gaze of his eyes firmly fixed on Thor. A deep breath, and murmuring to himself, he said, "All right, old boy. Let's see if you remember." It was Jake, Thor's former handler. He had served with Thor for years, but time and life had taken them down different paths. Jake had never forgotten the bond he shared with his loyal companion. Tonight, he was here to see if Thor still remembered him. Jake approached slowly, a lump forming in his throat. "Hey boy," he called softly, his voice cracking just a little. "It's me, buddy. It's Jake." Thor's ears perked up, his eyes locking onto the shadowy figure. For a moment, there was silence, the tension thick in the air. Then Thor's growl deepened, his body tensing. He bared his teeth, a warning. This wasn't the response Jake had hoped for. "Whoa, easy there, big guy," Jake said, holding his hands up. He took a step forward, a nervous smile on his face. "It's me. Remember?" Thor stood up, hackles raised, a deep guttural bark echoing down the street. Jake flinched, his confidence wavering. This wasn't going as planned. He looked around, hoping none of the neighbors were watching. The last thing he needed was to explain why an old war dog was about to tear him to shreds. All right, Jake muttered, taking a cautious step back. "Maybe I should have brought some treats or something." He forced a chuckle, but Thor wasn't amused. The dog's eyes were locked on him, his stance rigid, every muscle ready to spring into action. Suddenly, from inside the house, a voice shouted out, "Thor! What's all the barking about out there?" It was Mrs. Kowalski, Thor's new owner, an elderly, feisty old lady who had taken Thor in when he retired. She came to the door and glared at Jake, who looked really out of place in her yard. "Who are you, and what do you think you're doing?" she demanded sharply. Jake swallowed, raising his hands again in a placating gesture. Ma'am, I'm Jake. I used to be Thor's handler. I just wanted to see if he remembered me." Mrs. Kowalski eyed him suspiciously, her gaze shifting to Thor, who was still growling, his eyes never leaving Jake. "Well, it doesn't look like he does," she said bluntly. "And if you keep standing there, you might lose a leg." Jake forced another smile, trying to hide his nervousness. "Yeah, I'm starting to get that impression." Mrs. Kowalski stepped forward, her hands on her hips. "Thor, heel!" she commanded, her voice firm. Thor hesitated, his eyes flicking towards her, then back to Jake. He gave one last growl before slowly backing down, his ears flattening as he returned to his spot on the porch. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized had been holding. "Thank you, ma'am. I really didn't mean to cause any trouble." Mrs. Kowalski eyed him a moment longer before her expression softened, just a little. "You said you were his handler?" Jake nodded. "Yes, ma'am. We served together overseas. He saved my life more times than I can count. I wanted to see him again." Mrs. Kowalski's glare slackened, and she let out a sigh. "Well, you can't just sneak up on him like that. He's not as young as he used to be, and neither are you, by the looks of it." She eyed Jake's worn jacket and tired eyes. "If you want to see Thor, you do it properly. Come by during the day. I'll make some tea, and you can sit and talk to him. Maybe then he'll remember you." Jake blinked, surprised by the sudden invitation. Oh, I appreciate that, ma'am. Really, I do. Mrs. Kowalski just nodded curtly. Just don't make a habit of creeping around my yard at night, all right? Or next time, I might just let Thor finish what he started. Jake laughed nervously, nodding. Understood. I'll see myself out. As Jake turned to leave, his eyes returned to Thor. Thor watched him with those same intense eyes, and still, there was no recognition, no spark of a bond that was once so strong. That stung, more than Jake cared to admit. But as he walked away, he heard Mrs. Kowalski's words, a faint echo within his head. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance with time, Thor would remember. The next morning, Jake was standing at Mrs. Kowalski's front door, a bag of dog treats clutched in his hand. He took another deep breath and knocked. The sound seemed to reverberate through the quiet morning. The door opened, and Mrs. Kowalski stood there, eyeing him with the same no-nonsense look as the night before. You came back, she said, almost as if she hadn't expected him to. Jake nodded, holding up the bag of treats with a sheepish grin. Figured I'd try a different approach this time. Mrs. Kowalski looked at the bag, then stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. All right then. Come on in. Thor's out back. Let's see if he remembers anything today. Jake stepped inside, his heart drumming in his chest, as he followed Mrs. Kowalski through the house and to the backyard. There, beneath the shade of an enormous oak tree, lay Thor, his eyes half closed as he enjoyed the morning breeze. At the sound of the door, his ears perked up and his head turned, his eyes locking onto Jake. Jake knelt down a few feet away, holding out one of the treats. Hey boy, he said softly. It's me again. Remember? Thor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jake thought he might start growling again. But then the dog's nose twitched, and he sniffed the air, his gaze shifting to the treat in Jake's hand. Slowly, Thor got up, his movements cautious as he approached. Jake held his breath, his hand steady as Thor came closer, sniffing the treat. The seconds elongated while the tension grew almost unbearable. Then, Thor took the treat, his eyes lifting to meet Jake's. There was a flicker, just a flicker, of something in those eyes, a glimmer of recognition. Jake's heart welled, a smile spreading across his face. That's it, boy. You remember, don't you? Thor chewed the treat slowly, his eyes never leaving Jake's. He stepped closer, sniffing Jake's hand, his ears perked up slightly. Jake reached out, his hand brushed along Thor's fur, and the old dog didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in, just a little, his nose nudging Jake's palm. Mrs. Kowalski had watched from the porch, her stern expression softening as she saw the two reunite. She shook her head, tugging a small smile onto her lips. Looks like he remembers after all, she said quietly. Jake looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers. Thank you, ma'am. This means a lot. Mrs. Kowalski nodded. Just take it slow. He's been through a lot, just like you have. Jake nodded, his hand falling naturally onto Thor's head. Yeah, well, take it one day at a time. And as Thor settled beside him, the warmth of his old friend filling that empty space in his heart, Jake knew this was the real treasure, finding his way back to someone who had always been there for him, even though it took a little bit of time to remember. The days turned into weeks, and Jake became a visitor at Mrs. Kowalski's home. Each morning, he would show up with a bag of treats and a hopeful smile, and each morning, Thor would take a little longer to recognize him. It was slow, sometimes frustrating, but Jake was patient. He knew that the bond they had shared couldn't be forgotten overnight. Mrs. Kowalski had grown accustomed to his presence. She would sit on the porch, sipping her tea, while Jake worked with Thor out in the backyard. It had been simple things at first, feeding him treats, getting Thor used to his scent again. But as the days went by, Jake began to push it a little further. He brought along some of the old commands they had used in the military, testing Thor's memory. Sit, Thor, Jake said one morning, holding a treat in his hand. Thor's eyes narrowed and his ears perked up. Hesitating for a second, he then slowly sat down, never taking his eyes off Jake. Good boy, Jake said, his voice full of warmth as he handed Thor the treat, his heart swelling with pride. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Mrs. Kowalski, who was watching from her chair, called out, "You're getting there, Jake. Just don't rush him. He's not as spry as he used to be." Jake nodded, looking over his shoulder with a grin. "I know, ma'am. I won't push him too hard." He turned back to Thor, kneeling down and rubbing the dog's ears. "We got all the time in the world, right, buddy?" Thor let out a soft huff, leaning into Jake's touch. There was a gentleness in his eyes now, a trust that was slowly rebuilding. Jake knew it wasn't just about the treats. It was about the time they spent together, the familiarity, the bond that was slowly coming back to life. One afternoon, Mrs. Kowalski invited Jake to stay for lunch. She had made a pot of stew, and they sat at her small kitchen table, the aroma of the food filling the room. Thor lay by Jake's feet, his eyes half closed, content. "So, Jake," Mrs. Kowalski began, her eyes studying him, "what are you doing these days? I mean, besides trying to get this old dog to remember you." Jake hesitated, his gaze falling to his bowl. "Not much, honestly. I've been working odd jobs here and there. Nothing steady." He let out a sigh, the hint of weariness in his voice. "It's been tough since I got out. Hard to find something that feels right." Mrs. Kowalski nodded, her face softening. "I imagine it is. You spend so long doing one thing, and then suddenly it's gone. Must be hard to find your footing again." Jake looked up, meeting her gaze. "Yeah. It is. But Thor. Being here with him, it helps. Makes me feel like I have a purpose again, you know?" Mrs. Kowalski smiled, a rare warmth in her eyes. "Well, you're doing good by him. And by me, too. He seems happier since you've been coming around." Jake's heart swelled at her words. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot." They ate for some time in comfortable silence, the only sound the clinking of their spoons against the bowls. Thor let out a soft sigh, his body relaxing further as he lay at Jake's feet, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt a sense of peace, a feeling that maybe things were going to be okay. The next morning, Jake showed up with a surprise. He had brought along an old tennis ball, one that Thor used to love playing with back in the day. He held it up, a grin spreading across his face as he knelt in front of Thor. "Hey, buddy. Remember this?" Thor's eyes widened, and his ears perked up at the sight of the ball. He sniffed the air, his tail giving a tentative wag. Jake chuckled, tossing the ball a short distance across the yard. Thor hesitated for a moment, then got to his feet, his eyes locked on the ball. Slowly, he trotted over, picked it up in his mouth, and turned back to Jake, his tail now wagging with much more enthusiasm. "That's it, boy. Good job," Jake called, clapping his hands. Thor trotted back over, dropping the ball at Jake's feet, his eyes bright with excitement. It was like a piece of the old Thor had returned, the playful, loyal dog Jake remembered so well. Mrs. Kowalski stood in the porch, her severe countenance yielding to a smile. "Look at that," she said in an odd and fond voice. "He hasn't played like that in years." Jake beamed, picking up the ball and giving it another toss. Thor barked a joyful sound that made Jake's heart soar as he ran after it, his old joints moving a little more smoothly now, the stiffness seeming to fade with each joyful stride. As the days turned into weeks, Jake and Thor became closer. The once grumpy, aloof war dog was slowly transforming back into the companion he had been, a dog filled with loyalty, playfulness, and a gentle spirit. It wasn't just about the commands or the treats. It was about the time they spent together, the trust that was being rebuilt piece by piece. One morning, as Jake was arriving at Mrs. Kowalski's house, he found her waiting for him at the door, a strange expression on her face. She gestured for him to come in, her eyes serious. "Jake, there's something I need to show you." Jake's heart skipped a beat, worry flashing across his face. "Is everything all right? Is it Thor?" Mrs. Kowalski just shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Just come with me." She took him through the house and out into the backyard, where Thor was lying under the oak tree, eyes alert, watching them. Mrs. Kowalski crossed the yard to the far side, kneeling and pointing to something half buried in the dirt, a small, weathered box, its edges worn and cracked with age. "I found this last night," she said, her voice low. "Thor was digging over here, and I saw it sticking out of the ground. I think it's something from his past." Jake knelt beside her, his brow furrowing as he examined the box. He reached out, brushing away the dirt, his fingers trembling slightly. Carefully, he lifted the box from the ground, the weight of it surprising him. He glanced at Mrs. Kowalski, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Go on," she said. "Open it." Jake took a deep breath, his heart pounding, as he slowly lifted the lid. Inside, he found a collection of old photographs, dog tags, and a worn-out collar, Thor's collar, from their time in the military. The sight of it took Jake's breath away, memories flooding back in a rush. He picked up the collar, his fingers tracing the faded lettering of Thor's name, the metal tag cold against his skin. Mrs. Kowalski watched in silence as the emotion began to show in Jake's face. "I think he remembered," she said quietly. "He remembered you, Jake. And he wanted you to have this." Jake swallowed hard, his eyes stinging. He looked over at Thor, who was watching them from under the tree, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Jake stood, crossing the yard and kneeling in front of Thor, the collar still in his hand. "You remembered, didn't you, boy?" Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Thor let out a small whine, leaned his head forward, and nudged Jake's hand, regarding him with soft eyes that radiated trust. Jake smiled, his heart swelling with love for his old friend. He slipped the collar back over Thor's head, the fit a little loose now, but it didn't matter. It was a symbol of their bond, a reminder of everything they had been through together. Mrs. Kowalski watched, a distance away, the warmth of the moment touching her very core. She had never understood any soldier and his dog relation not until she saw them with her own eyes, unbreakable, welded in the fire of difficulties and sacrifices, and strong enough that no length of time or space could fully break it. As Jake sat beside Thor, his hand laid on the dog's back, he knew this was where he was supposed to be. It was not about finding a new purpose or trying to recapture the past. It was simply about being here in this moment with his friend, who had never truly forgotten him. And as the sun climbed higher, casting its warmth over the yard, Jake knew everything would turn out all right. He had his way back to Thor, and together they would meet whatever came next, one day at a time. Jake and Thor's bond was growing stronger, and very soon it was like they had never been separated from each other. Days molded into comfortable routine. Jake would arrive early in the morning with either some treats, toys, or anything that he thought would brighten Thor's day, and they spent their hours in the backyard. The once quiet and solitary yard of Thor became filled with laughter, barks, and the warmth of a rediscovered friendship. One bright afternoon, Jake brought something special, a harness with a small cart attached. It was similar to the kind they used during their time in the military, for transporting equipment, or even injured soldiers. This one, though, was smaller, designed for lighter loads. Jake looked at Thor, a playful glint in his eyes. "Hey, buddy," Jake called, patting the cart. "You remember this? Thought we could put those old muscles to good use again." Thor eyed the harness with curiosity and skepticism, his ears flicking back and forth. Mrs. Kowalski raised an eyebrow, lips curving into an amused smile as she watched from her chair on the porch. "You think he's up for it, Jake? He's not exactly a young pup anymore." Jake chuckled and gave Thor a reassuring pat. "I think he can handle it, ma'am. He's still got some fight left in him." He knelt beside Thor, adjusting the harness straps gently. Thor stood still, watching Jake's hands move with an expression that was almost contemplative, as if he was remembering the times they had worked together like this. With the harness finally secured, Jake gave Thor an encouraging nod. "All right, big guy, let's give it a try." He placed a few logs in the cart, nothing too heavy, just enough to add a bit of weight. Thor looked back at the cart, then at Jake, his tail giving a slow wag. "That's it," Jake said softly. "Just like old times. Easy does it." Thor took a step forward, the cart rolling behind him. For a moment he hesitated, but when Jake walked alongside him, his voice calm and steady, Thor seemed to relax. He pulled the cart across the yard, his stride growing more confident with each step. Jake walked beside him, his hand resting on Thor's back, his smile broad and proud. Mrs. Kowalski clapped her hands, shining bright eyes. "Well, will you look at that? He's still got it," she called out, full of admiration. Jake laughed and nodded. "That's right, ma'am. He's still got it." He knelt as Thor came to a stop, unhooking the harness and giving Thor a well-deserved pat on the head. "Good job, buddy. You're as strong as ever." Thor huffed, his eyes sparkling with excitement. He nudged Jake's shoulder, his tail wagging in excitement. It was times like these that reminded Jake of their time in service, not the hardships or the danger, but the camaraderie, the sense of purpose that came from working side by side with someone you trusted with your life. Later that afternoon, when the sun had started to dip toward the horizon, Mrs. Kowalski brought out a pitcher of lemonade and a few glasses, setting them on the porch table. "Come on over, Jake. You've earned a break." Jake wiped his brow, smiling as he ambled over, Thor trotting with him. He sat down, and Thor lay down at his feet, his head laying on Jake's boots. Mrs. Kowalski poured the lemonades, handing a glass over to Jake, her expression softening as she eyed Thor. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "when Thor first came here, he was so withdrawn. It was like he was lost, like he didn't know what to do with himself anymore. But now, seeing him with you, it's like he's found his place again." Jake sipped the lemonade, his gaze flowing to Thor, who looked up at him with those soft, trusting eyes. "I think we both have," he said softly. "I didn't realize how much I needed this too." Mrs. Kowalski nodded, her expression softening. "You two were meant to find each other again. Some bonds just can't be broken, no matter how much time passes." Jake smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am. For letting me be here. For letting me have this time with him." Mrs. Kowalski waved a hand dismissively, though her eyes were misty. "Nonsense. You belong here as much as he does. Besides, it's nice to have some company around here. Makes the place feel alive again." For a time, they sat in easy silence, the light breeze rustling the leaves of the oak tree. Thor gave a happy sigh, his eyes half closing, and Jake leaned forward, scratching behind his ears. It was a simple moment, but it was perfect, a reminder of everything they had fought for, everything they had survived for. The next morning, Jake arrived as usual, but today there was something in the air, a feeling of excitement, a premonition that something important was about to happen. He found Mrs. Kowalski waiting for him on the porch, a smile playing on her lips. "Morning, Jake," she called out, her eyes twinkling. "Thor's already out back. I think he's waiting for you." Jake arched an eyebrow, interested. "Is that so? Well, I'd better not keep him waiting then." He made his way to the backyard, his heart racing with anticipation. There, in the shade of the big oak, stood Thor, and next to him was what made Jake do a double take, half a dozen or so neighborhood kids, each clutching some toy or snack, their faces agog with wonder as they gazed upon Thor. One little boy, with a baseball cap and everything, was kneeling before Thor, offering him a toy soldier. "Can he play with us?" the boy asked, looking up at Jake as he approached. Jake looked over at Mrs. Kowalski, who had followed him out. Her smile was still there, wider now. "I thought it might be nice for Thor to have some new friends," she said. "These kids have been asking about him for weeks." A lump had already formed in Jake's throat as he looked from the children to Thor, whose tail wagged slow, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Well, what do you say, buddy? You up for making some new friends?" Thor let out a low woof, his tail wagging slightly quicker. Jake knelt down beside him, rubbing his neck. "All right then," he said in his emotionally packed voice. "Let's do this." The children closed in around him, their excitement almost too much to contain. They took turns throwing the tennis ball for Thor, who chased after it with as much zeal as he did when serving in the military. Jake watched, his heart swelling with pride and love for his old friend. Thor was in his element, bathed by laughter, joy, and the simple pleasures of life. All the weight he had carried, all the terrors of his past, had finally lifted. Mrs. Kowalski sat on the porch, watching as her heart swelled with emotion. She had always known that there was something special about Thor, something beyond his service or his training. He was a gentle soul, a heart destined to bring people together, to heal and to love. Now, looking at him surrounded by kids, his eyes bright and his tail wagging, she knew he had finally found his true calling. As the sun began to set, the children said their goodbyes, each giving Thor a pat on the head before leaving. Jake stood by, his heart full, watching as Thor lay down under the oak tree, a contented sigh escaping his lips. Mrs. Kowalski came over, her eyes soft as she looked at Jake. "You know, I think this is exactly what he needed. What both of you needed." Jake nodded, his eyes misty. "Yeah, I think you're right." He knelt next to Thor and laid a hand on the dog's back. "We've been through so much, haven't we, boy? But I think we're finally where we're meant to be." Thor let out a soft huff, his eyes closing as he relaxed into the grass. Jake smiled, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. He had found his way back to his old friend, and together they had found a new purpose, a life filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. As the stars started to pop out of the sky, Jake sat beside Thor. His hand lay gently on the big dog's back. He looked up toward the sky, those first stars twinkling above, and knew no matter what lay ahead, they would meet it together, day by day, like they always had.